be hoping this can be is a space for honest dialogue across generations. There was a participant, Mama, I think it was you, who asked about having a discussion across generations, and I believe this session will be just that. So that we reflect on what does it mean to build and sustain democracy, both for today and tomorrow. As I said day before yesterday, and I believe this has come out clearly throughout the conversations, this is a time when there is a visible strain on democracy across the region. This is not an East African problem, it's not a West African problem, it's an African and a global problem. But what we are seeing across the board are the same things. There's a weakening and a shrinking of the civic space. There's institutional fatigue, and there's an erosion of public trust. People don't trust systems and those who hold power. And yet, we continue to show up to vote, we continue to show up to protest, we continue to show up to organize, and people continue to offer themselves to serve. So this signals that there's not a failure of democracy's promise, but really it's a call to reimagine how that promise will be shared going forward. So I've heard, and I think those of us who are in Kenya now, and I think Mongela also spoke to this earlier, consistently people calling generations Gen Z children. And I think part of the reason why there's that classification of Gen Z as children is a call for them to be kept in their place. But the conversation that we need to have now is really about what can both the young and the older generations do. Because the young people are the ones pushing the movement now, but older generations have also built and defended, and in many cases also sacrificed for the democratic gains that we enjoy today. And I'm happy to see Njeri Kabeberi in the room and others who've gone ahead of us. Thank you, Ma. So there have also been times, unfortunately, and I know millennials, we've been accused of this, where we have been accused of presiding over or being silent during periods of democratic backsliding. So we are seeing an unprecedented move of mobilization. There's protesting, there's educating, there's organizing, and there's speaking out. As an academic and as a democratic practitioner, one of the things I've seen also, unfortunately, is as vocal as young people are, they are not as active in voter registration. So in 2022, for example, we saw youth voter registration drop by 5.27%, and only 3% of people who were surveyed last year showed that they actually hold a political office or a political seat. Yet, we have about 94% of the young people saying they intend to vote in the next election. So we have a shared challenge. How do we make sure that we are passing down the ideals of democracy, that we are co-owning, that we are shaping the experience together, so that we have both old and new ideas, new actors, and new visions? Because democracy at its heart is really about intergenerational equity. There must be a state of intergenerational equity which strengthens the resilience of democracy itself. So to move forward in this vision of democracy, we must move beyond performative inclusion. We must confront structural inequalities, where less powerful generations, especially young people, disabled people, women, often lack the agency in political processes, and they are excluded from politics routinely. So in societies which have been marked with this kind of competition, we must have intergenerational dialogue so that we build understanding, so that we promote reciprocity and we share responsibility. So this session is not about praise or blame. It's really about recognizing that no generation can build or defend democracy alone. A just future will depend on the strength of the bridges that we will build between generations today. So allow me to invite my panelists, and as they come, I'll be inviting them to think about the following. And this is what I'm also asking the room to think about. What does meaningful intergenerational dialogue and leadership look like? Not just in rhetoric, not academically, but in policy and in practice. Number two, how do we move from symbolic gestures? We saw last year when we complained about the composition of government, the cabinet was all fired, and then the same people were reappointed. So there was a gesture which was simply symbolic, but it didn't change anything in terms of how power is shared in this country. So how do we move beyond symbolic gestures to shared power? And then what must each of us do? Because as I've said, millennials have been blamed for sleeping on the job. Young people are saying we need to carry the mantle because those before us let us down. Great. So what must we all do, regardless of our age, to shape a democratic future that works for all of us? To help us have this discussion, I will invite 4 people. I'll start with Nerima Wako Ojiwa, who is Executive Director, Siasa Place. Siasa Place, for those who may not know, is a youth-led, youth-focused civic tech organization that is working on building confidence, skills, competencies, and institutional structures. Welcome, Nerima. Next, I'll invite Christina Lai, Transitional Justice Advisor, Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, and Vice Chairperson of ICJ Kenya. Karibu sana Tina. I'll also invite Arnold Tsunga, who is going to be representing the African Judges and Juries Forum, the birthday man. For those who don't know the AJJF is a Pan-African network of judges and jurists who want to work towards justice and development in Africa. Last but definitely not least is Wagoi Wajora, who is a policy maker and community organizer with Social Justice Movement Nairobi chapter, the Ngong Social Justice Center. Welcome. So we'll just start with a few. Good. So we'll just start with a few reflection questions before everyone speaks to their area of expertise. And for everyone, I'd like to just hear your thoughts. What does intergenerational dialogue and leadership look like? I mean, we're not talking about symbolism or rhetoric, youth being the leaders of tomorrow, all of those things we have heard. What does it practically mean to have an intergenerational dialogue on leadership and democracy going forward? What does it practically look like for each one of you? You may use the mic in front of you. So I'll start with Tina, and then we'll come in this direction.
Is it on? Good afternoon. Let me just take a few minutes or seconds as I begin to appreciate our partners who have partnered with ICJ Kenya to convene this forum. Unfortunately, I couldn't be with you over the past 2 days in person, but I have been following the conversations online, and I must say they've been very insightful, deeply reflective, very interesting case studies and reflections, so thank you for that. On to this question. I speak to this question as a young person who has crossed over several transitions, let me say, within our Kenyan experience. I started my career as a young lawyer in 2004, graduated 2004. 2007, when the post-election violence broke out, I was transitioning from an intern at the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. And bear in mind that my inspiration to study law was informed by the visions I had seen on television. We know the famous video of Reverend Joya being whipped on the streets. We had seen the women, Jerry spoke about this yesterday, on day one, who were agitating for the release of the political detainees. We saw the agitation for multipartism, and it was very vivid in my mind. As a young person growing up, I knew I wanted to be an advocate, either as a journalist, not so much a lawyer. My parents steered me that way, but it worked well. And so you can imagine just beginning out in 2007, and then there's this outbreak of the worst atrocities that we had experienced in our history. And then began the journey of trying to pursue justice. And that is why today I've continued to practice transitional justice. However, the crux of the response that I wanted to give is this. As I began working with these survivors of post-election violence and the aftermath of that period, the Kenya National Dialogue and Reconciliation Agreement with a very clear framework on how we will draw the red line. We will have a new constitution, we will have land reforms, we'll have security sector reforms. It all looked very flowery and possible. And in fact, it seemed like it couldn't get any worse. We couldn't be any worse than hacking each other on the streets and banning children in a church. And so I held on to the promise that this is what our future looks like. Then come 2013, and what do? We elect the two greatest or most suspected individuals for those heinous crimes to be our president and deputy president. If not a clear depiction of this reality, that democracy, the progression in democracy is not linear. It's got waves and counter waves, forward and backward. Reality, I would say, for me as a young person, that then got me to this space of really reflecting, but what does it mean? What does agitate for these principles, human rights principles, democratic principles? What are we after? And do we ever achieve it? Can we ever grasp it? And so, in a nutshell, I think the response in terms of intergenerational dialogue is the realization that as the human race, we're aspiring for certain ideals and principles: inclusivity, respect for human rights, rule of law. We are continuously making incremental change, but the change is not linear. And that is why every generation has a struggle. Each generation must make its contribution. The past generation's contribution is no less significant than the present generation's contribution. Today, we clasp onto our 2010 Constitution because the guarantees are now spelled out in there. Those who came before us were speaking about ideals, many a times never articulated in our Constitution or in our laws. That is progress. But progress is not linear. And that is what intergenerational dialogue looks like. It's continuously reflecting back and building forward. And that's only possible when we connect the dots.
That's so hard to come after. But thank you so much, Tina. So for me, I would add on to that and say that, you know, everyone has a say, not necessarily your way, because I found myself in boards as a young person where I have felt completely useless and tokenistic. And I have dropped out of those boards. And so for me, intergenerational, I believe it's going against our culture because there's a certain element of ageism, you know, where it's like, what do you know? We have so many sayings, you know, like, you know, what an elder can see, what sitting, a youth can never see standing. You know, you can quote them. There's so many that exist even in our own historical context that now when you talk about, you know, everybody at the table, it's a little odd. And, you know, I come from a community where sometimes women are not allowed to sit on the chair when you're having community dialogue. Let's be real. Or even when you're discussing a burial, women, sometimes you're not even allowed to be in that conversation. We're not even talking about a wedding, which is a celebration. And so for me, I think that intergenerational is something where we are breaking barriers, we're breaking culture. I think it's necessary, I think it's important, but it also comes with the element of what are we growing toward, what are we changing toward, and there are some aspects of tradition that we want to keep, and sometimes we think about aspects that we want to let go. I think that's also a very important element of intergenerational dialogue and leadership. And because even when we talk about democracy, we're talking about politics. And we know how the Council of Elders determines our politics. Let's not lie here. People need to be endorsed by elders in some communities here. And there's also the fact that there are some communities, even for women to lead, that's a whole other story. When you want to talk about young women, that's a whole other story. So for me, it would be being authentic to some of the barriers that already exist, and then finding our ways to maneuver around them and what that means. I feel that people have the solutions, and it's to allow people to lead whatever that solution looks for them, and not imposing some aspects of intergeneration that we think can work for us because we see it working in perhaps Western countries or elsewhere.
Thank you very much, and maybe just to thank the organizers for this wonderful meeting. To be frank, this year maybe is the first meeting I have attended where I've truly felt like I'm learning something, and that there is actually intergenerational dialogue. So I endorse what my two sisters have already said, and maybe for the sake of time, it's not necessary to repeat what they said, other than just to reinforce that, it's easy when societies are going through stress for generational conflicts, if I can put it that way, or generational blame. And because I think when you're growing up, even in families, it's always easy for the old people to say, when we were kids or when we were young, you would never used to do things this way. You were a bit more capable, a bit more alert. But similarly, when youngsters face problems, it's also easy for them to say, these old people, they're old-fashioned and the world has changed. And so that generational blame, it can happen. And I think societies that compete, that grow, and are anchored on intergenerational vision rather than generational vision and contestations. And so when you look at some of the states in the world that have really performed in terms of creating opportunities for their own citizens economically, and to get opportunities for growth, I think it's the societies where there has been visions and that have been carried from one generation to another, unlike a situation where the national vision is linked to the political electoral cycle, where if you take one party out, then everything changes and society starts afresh, because in the process you lose the value of continuity, especially about good things, and then you also lose consolidating on important foundational structures. So I think intergenerational dialogue is what we did here from the very beginning, and I really want to congratulate the designers of the program. They all brought us here. I spent a lot of time listening, and I could see that the inspiration I'm getting about the fact that Kenya and some East African countries, but in particular Kenya, there seems to be a situation where there's consolidation of democratic gains. And it may look like there's a generational conflict, but I think it's actually intergenerational sharing and building. And I think that's what we need in Africa.
Viva, comrades, viva. I think my comrades here have spoken very wisely, and I just want to add maybe one or two things. First, this discussion is very timely on perspectives of what is going on in our continent today. So I'd like to thank the organizers and the foundation and ICJ for setting all this up. across our region, we have stood on the shoulders of elders who have fought for the freedom of our nations and have continuously stood there fighting for our freedom and our democratic spaces. So these elders and this wisdom and the energy that the youth have, we need to find a place of convergence, a place where all this wisdom and all this energy finds to meet so that we can make progressive engagements. And in the discussions that have been here before, in my analysis, I'd like to say that this is a systemic problem. In Africa, we had our systems before we were colonized. And this system that we're using now is a colonial system. And it has proven time and time over again, it will not work for us. In perspective of when we were talking yesterday of a free and fair election, we say there is no free, there is no fair. So our elections have been rigged already by the system. And change that we aspire to make, we cannot make in this system, because this system is hindering everything that we are working against. In the Constitution of Kenya 2010, we have rights of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And how many times have we seen this law and these freedoms frequently infringed? Even on our international media, there's a very progressive channel called African Stream. You guys have heard of it, doing very radical and very true stories. But how many times have we seen this channel shut down? I saw on their page they have said that the government have been constantly working towards shutting them down, and finally they cannot put up with it. They shut down at the beginning of this month that we are in. And so my point is, we need to find a system. We need to sit down and have intergenerational, because even the panel that was here said that we fight this, we finish, there is another war. We can't be constantly saying that each generation is going to be fighting wars. Because when do we get the chance to sit down and live? Because we did not come here to fight. We came here to enjoy, have a good time, sindio, smile kidogo, feel good, sindio. So we cannot keep fighting. We have to fight one last time as generations, hold each other's hands, show each other the way, because I believe a lot of wisdom is from these other generations. Gen Z zile kitu tuko nayo ni strength. Sai, if a tear gas was thrown here, right now, you see Mwanaidi where she's seated there? Unaona Mwanaidi pale? She will jump from that window to the ground floor. But my comrade here, before he figures out which direction to run, the tear gas has overwhelmed him. But if we sit down and he shows a little direction to our energy, there's a lot of progress that we can make. So we have to hold each other's hands, and at the end of the day realize that the enemy is not Museveni, the enemy is not Ruto, the enemy is not all those other names. Sindio? The enemy for us is this systemic issue on Africa, because Africans, we had our own systems governed by different people. So, and we were very, very productive, very rich. So we have to find a way to sustain our richness for ourselves. Yeah.
Thank you, Agui. I'm glad that there's consensus on the panel that we need intergenerational dialogue, because as I said, sometimes when we listen to the conversations, there's one Gen Z who told me, you millennials, you know nothing. You betrayed us. You are all deceived. You know nothing. I said, my word. I was so wounded. So I'm glad that there's at least consensus that there is power in intergenerational dialogue. I think the question then becomes, how do we structure the dialogue? Because we are operating at different spaces, we organize differently, and I think my next question to the panel would be, what in your assessment would it take to truly harness the power of this intergenerational dialogue? What platforms are you proposing? Whether it's a civic platform, an institutional platform, a digital platform, a community-based platform, what do you think it's going to take to move this intergenerational dialogue forward so that it's meaningful for governance going forward? So I'm going to start in the reverse order. So Agui.
Aya. Nikisema viva nitasema viva mingi. So let me just answer. So in our community organizing, let me speak in perspective of social justice movement Nairobi chapter, because that's where I am an expert in. And our intergenerational conversations, we've been having them through people's assemblies. When I talk of people's assemblies, I mean people's assemblies that have been politicized. Like people's barazas, but political people barazas, where there is continuous political education. And I'm not saying civic education, I am saying political education in an aim to radicalize the people to achieve what we intend to achieve. Because we have comrades here all over Africa. And if, for instance, my sister from Uganda, I came up with solution for a problem in Uganda. What's the percentage of me getting it right? Probably 0 point something. Because I am not from that area. I don't know what their problems are. Maybe I'm coming with solutions to problems that they don't have. You see? In terms of engaging people in finding solutions for themselves. In knowing your problem, you know your solution. Because if there is a very bad way of doing public participation in our country, where the government sits down, decides we need new roads, come and builds roads, or brings a public participation for road building. But we don't need roads. What do we need? We need medicine in our hospital. True. Sometimes we don't even need these new hospitals. We need these hospitals that are there to actually work. In terms of people are being paid, health workers, in terms of medicine being there, it's crazy because sometimes you see politicians flagging off hundreds of lorries with medicines. And if you go to a public health facility, there is no medicine. You go to a private chemist, there is medicine with the government of Kenya stamp, not for sale. But you're going to buy this medicine because you're actually sick and you need this medicine, or your baby is sick. So what I'm trying to imply is people know their own solutions. So let people be pertinent of creating solutions for themselves. Yeah.
Thank you. I think the question about the structure is a very important question. But at the same time, let me also confess that being among the youths and young people and who are showing an immense amount of vision beyond beyond what I'm used to coming from Southern Africa. I'm from Zimbabwe myself, and we don't have the same amount of energy in terms of young people trying to drive the governance agenda. So I'm learning a lot and also humbled and therefore a little scared. So, but then the sister from the social justice movement was here before you. She spoke about resources at the end and saying we have a difficulty about resources. And I think that dovetails into the question of structure, because sometimes it's the way in which you're structured that then influences the degree of fundability or ability to mobilize resources. And it's not your fault, but it simply takes us into the question that Willie Mutunga spoke about yesterday, to say, whilst we can look at the local, the regional, we should not delink it from the global. Because the way in which the funding models for the struggles have happened is that the structure sometimes becomes more important than the substance, form than substance. And those among us who have become social entrepreneurs and who understand the movement of resources within the international development sector will know that if you're an NGO, you are likely to get more resources. You are likely to be able to write proposals that answer to the question of results, matrix, logical frameworks. And yet, if you are in the social movement, and so what people in the previous section were describing as leaderless movements, cause-driven initiatives, you find that you may know what you want, but because you've not articulated it in a proposal and in a logical framework, in a results-based metric, to the point that those who are financial gatekeepers in the development sector understand, then you don't get funding. And as a result, the substantive thrust of your efforts is not complemented by the structural design of your movement. And that then creates a situation where you are the most likely instrument of change and transformation of society, but they're not structured in a way that can absorb development finance. And as a result, people are then forced to begin to figure out, are we in the right structure? Do we have the right people that we've employed? And are we able to write our ideas in a way that we can get resources? And that process is a very exhausting process for some of us who have been involved in this for a long time, because slowly there is a substitution of purpose from going for the cause into looking at whether your form and structure is fit for purpose in terms of funding. And that process is a very slow process. And the people who then begin to be given recognition in movements and in institutions are those who have got this professional technical capacity to do proposal writing, who have the ability to define what objectives, outcomes. That language which is used, and in the process, the moment you then begin to rely more on people who may actually sell their technical skill to help you get resources, and they become the powerful people, then before you notice it, you begin to think more on whether what you want to do is potentially fundable. Are you able to then report on it? Are you able to capture the results in a way that a donor will understand? And therefore, are you able to also capture impact in a way that will satisfy the key stakeholder, which is the donor? So I think this substitution of who the fundamental key stakeholder is in a social movement to what an NGO, including those that may actually be operating from briefcases, it reduces the ability of social movements, I think, to achieve their purpose. And it then takes me to the question of the structure of the human rights movement itself. Because here, when I came, I actually realized that we have colleagues, younger people, coming from what we're calling the social justice. You're calling it social justice sector, I don't know, or movement, centers, yeah. And then there's also a group of older people, or people that I've worked with for a long time in Kenya, who are in the NGO sector. And we call ourselves the human rights movement. So when you have a human rights movement that is interrogating the democracy question, the democratization question in Africa, and then you have this tension in society where there are institutions that are emerging in response to local issues that they want resolved and resolved yesterday. And then we then sit here as we normally do to interrogate and say, are we making progress or not? You start asking yourself, do we have the right people in the room? Or certainly the social justice movement is, yes, good. But NGOs, in Zimbabwe, there is a number of NGOs. Some of them actually now, the government has become a very big investor in the NGO sector. So we call them gangos, government-appointed NGOs, or gongos, government-owned NGOs. Some are called mongos, my own NGO. Some are called fongos, which is family-owned NGOs. Some are called pongos, which is privately owned NGOs. And then some are called even congos, which is company-owned NGOs. So this reason why this is a reason, I think, is precisely because of what I said earlier, that you are then able to manage results and produce evidence of impact in a way that satisfies donors more. Yeah. But the social movements will never be able to compete, I think, for resources that come from the West with these types of institutions. So we are losing in terms of our social movement justice impact. The donors are losing because they are funding unwinnable and less impactful interventions. They will never succeed because half of the money then ends up going to the government and to institutions that exist to extract donor funding. So I think that's important. And then maybe just to end, Willie yesterday spoke about the need for us to have a broader look than just local, national, regional, but to look at it in the global context. And I totally agree with him because of the fact that when you look, coming here to East Africa, I know that two East African countries, Rwanda and DRC, they currently have delegations that are flying to Qatar to solve some of the problems that we're discussing here. So I don't know whether anyone knows what those delegations are and what they're going to do and how Qatar as a country, I don't know the size of Qatar compared to Africa or East Africa, how they're going to resolve the problems that we have. But certainly, you ask yourself, why DRC, why Qatar, why the USA, which is driving this process? How are they going to resolve the DRC crisis? Why are they interested in DRC? And all those questions which we are not asking ourselves. But it's clear, because DRC itself, I think it has got the most strategic earth minerals that are relevant for the fourth industrial revolution. once we're getting into digitalization, into energy saving, processes, clean energy, you can't do that without minerals from the DRC. I think coltan is one of them. Then you also have quite a number that will be absolutely key for anyone who wants to be a global leader in the fourth industrial revolution. So Qatar is a very small country, smaller than all of East African community, the whole of African Union. They are going to be the ones that may actually be sitting now to resolve some of the problems about us that we are not discussing. This is why I think whilst the human rights movement is important to interrogate, it has to be a bigger conversation, multi-sectorial conversation on the democracy question in Africa. Thank you.
I want to agree so much with Wangui, what she's just mentioned. And we're an NGO, but I think we're a strange NGO because we support social justice centers, truly. And it's one of those things where, because of what you've just explained, the challenge. So even within our thinking of programs, there's always a line for support. I think that SJCs already know what the issues are. They already know what they need to do. And I don't even think I've attended any of your functions, assemblies. I don't think so. Yeah. So it's also a sense of leaving room for people to do what they do best without that sense of you're a puppet, manipulating, controlling, and deciding. They already decide the issues. They already build the communities. So we work in 17 counties. And we also work now, I've mentioned SJCs, we also work with community-based organizations, specifically. Some of them come to us and they don't even have certificates yet. They are thinking about it. And we nurture. So at the moment, we work with 26 CBOs. And even when I look at the protest of 25th, 11 of those counties are people we've worked with in the communities, in the counties. So you're seeing people already taking issues in their own counties, in their own communities, without you organizing, mobilizing, encouraging. And I think what's maybe a concern for me, because even as that exists, I would say encourage more people to do that and to leave the room. But also, what worries me is sometimes even the way media reports activists. And this needs to come out because these guys are in their communities. There's a certain level, I've seen this challenge where, especially when their influence grows, they become a threat. Not just government or whatever, but even there's a certain high regard the community has for them. So the way politicians have people coming to their door every time there's an issue, you guys deal with that. And I think why I'm mentioning the media, because I feel like it's a little bit forgotten in this convo, because there's an intentionality to vilify activists. So as much as we're here talking about democracy, change, transformation, the people who are at the forefront of it, being intentionally labeled and vilified as activists makes it even more difficult to push about that change. But also the way that word, that name, has been thrown on certain individuals that do not deserve it. And I know the young people in this room know who I'm talking about, or the certain people I'm talking about. And that, again, because of the choices that they make people doing the actual work, it almost negates their efforts. And this is important because that whole Gen Z framing came from the media. That label came from the media. Why couldn't it be patriotic young people? Why make it generational? Because they are millennials. I'm a millennial. And even the lawyers who are removing hundreds of people out of jail, millennials. The doctors, millennials. There are so many millennials. And I think it's very important to also recognize the way history is documenting all of this and labeling it, and we are continuing to build on it. And finally, it's a lot of young women. Another thing, media somehow just doesn't want to recognize. A lot of young women are in the forefront of this change, which again, it goes back to this intergenerational conversation, where when we've seen change in Africa, it's been women who come to the fore and they're like, it's enough. They're the ones who decide we are fasting. They're the ones who are deciding, you know, we're going to sit here, we're going to strip, we're going to stay at Freedom Corner. Like, it's women. And it's happening right now with young women. But somehow we miss that story. And I would say invest in the women organizing, invest in those in social justice centers, invest in the CBOs in the community. Because at the end of the day, the drugs you're talking about is the women in hospitals with their young babies who can't afford that medication. And a lot of the issues that we're talking about, a brunt of it is heavily covered by women. Yeah.
Thank you. I think my co-panelists have basically covered a lot of what I had in mind. But again, just reflecting back to the 18-year journey, if I was to speak to my younger self, I would want to hear this phrase. It's been claimed to have been stated by James Madison, that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and the next place, oblige it to control itself. And that just buttresses this point. Again, the phrase, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. That's really what intergenerational dialogue, that's the starting point. And it's speaking to a lot of what we've said. I would suggest that the first is in framing. How do we frame the quest for democracy and the quest for human rights? And that goes to a lot of what you were saying, Arnold. Even in terms of development partners, you're being asked, tell us your outcome in 5 years. In fact, when I started off, I don't know whether that's still happening, we would have phrases like end discrimination, end poverty. Our framing has crippled us in terms of playing the long game. And the long game must then require us to do several things. Not to be stuck in moments in time or mechanisms. We had a beautiful TJRC in Kenya. We have a beautiful report that is stacked in the shelf of the president since May 2013. And when you look at the similarities between the security apparatus being used for Nyayo House torture chambers, abductions by the special branch, today what we are seeing are those same practices replaying themselves. So I would say that the first is really framing the quest for democracy and our ideals in the long term, and programming, mobilizing to understand how we then achieve incremental change from one step to the next. And this requires that we're constantly asking ourselves, are we chipping away at the structural blocks that are enabling continuity of impunity, right? So when you're talking about free and fair elections, inclusivity of men, women, youth, what's our starting point? It's not in a vacuum. It is built on certain discriminatory foundations that we need to chip away at. But because of how much we need to deal with, we lose sight. We lose sight. So framing is one. Second is in that framing is how we tie, and we've said this many and time again, how do we tie elections to governance? It's that same framing, the long game. It was quite heartwarming for those of us who were called evil society during the ICC cases to see a young Gen Z on the street asking the public, what did you expect when you voted 2 criminals into office? It has come full circle. At the time, we obviously looked like we were playing a political battle, right? And that it was about ethnicity. But these are the structural things that we're talking about. And so there's a lot of talk on Twitter about who's going to be the next leader. And this brings me to the third strategy, which is what are the barriers? So we have this young population, which we're saying is issue-based. Converging, I think my generation, the millennials, right? So for example, yes, we have technology, we have Twitter, we have all of this. Is everybody on Twitter? Is everybody having a smartphone? Where are we having these conversations? And who are we leaving behind? Because indeed, the power of this next step lies in numbers. It lies in the people. It lies in demand to shift the change. And that needs us to have the kind of political education that Wango was talking about earlier, challenging donors in terms of how we write our concepts and our proposals and who's being funded, who's driving the agenda, and of course engaging more with the communities. It comes down to the people. But who are we leaving behind? So we need to do a mapping, we need to take a step back, and we need to look at the long game and ensure that our next step as the young people, converging with the older people, is progressive rather than retrogressive change. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. You've raised fantastic points, and I'm going to invite Wagoy and Nerima to speak to the next question, which is that we need to make sure that everyone is brought on board. We're not leaving anyone behind. But I think one of the questions that has come up, and the president said this in jest, but I think it's something that we must address, which is the question of how do we properly transition into the government that we want. We know that we have numbers to change the government, but the question is whether with this rising engagement, we have real political influence. I think that's the question. So I wanted Nerima to kindly just speak to the question of how do we now shift both strategically and structurally the numbers that we have, the high levels of civic engagement, political education, which is what Wagoy was talking about. I don't think we've ever had these kinds of levels of political education before. So how do we make sure that youth are not just participating online or in other spaces, but that they're truly influencing policy and leadership even as we look into the next elections? So I'd like you to speak to that. Yeah.
We currently have a campaign called Siasaya ID, and it started in March. And so far from March to June, we've had about 1,500 people register to get their IDs. So of course, one of the first things is encouraging people to get IDs. And this is something that you can already see the ground people want to do this. How do we know this? So government first started off by saying they're going to charge us for our identity cards. And you saw how he turned around on that. It's because of their work on the ground. People complained, right? And so that shows you people are really, really keen to make sure that they get their IDs subsidized or free. It should be free. But to make sure that they get access to their IDs. Another thing is this expiration thing on IDs. It's ridiculous. And so there are people who are consistently pushing back on that. I'll say the organizing is continuing. And out of the 36 ID centers we looked at across the country, 25% of them didn't have a service charter, which basically tells you this is how you get your ID, this is the process, this is how long it takes, da 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 da. This is important because there are some areas where people actually do not know. And so we could see this sense of almost an intentional curtailment of making sure there's an oppression or suppression of ID registration. And so we have ambassadors who are, even as we speak, they're about to now level up because after my ID, it's my voter's card. Yeah. So we've talked about that ground level. And there's also politicians doing these campaigns as well. But we need to also be concerned about the Electoral Bodies Commission. So even though we register, even though we do all these things, if we have a commission that is not independent, transparent, there's no goodwill, then what's the point? And for me, that's the thing that gives me sleepless nights. The fact that there's still a pending court case, the fact that they're saying it's going to be in September, we are already seeing political leaders saying there'll be no election in 2027 because of the timelines of having at least 2 years of having a functioning commission. The court case September, we are past the 2-year mark. So this is a disaster. If we do not channel these energies into a system, then be prepared for a collapse. Because let me tell you, and I'm sure Wangoi will add on to this, there will be no participation of anyone if we see that this institution is not going to be on the side of the people. Yeah. They would rather nobody votes that day, and they will interfere with those who think they will go and vote. They would rather nobody votes that day, and they say this election is a sham. And that's what we're dealing with. I think we have a government that thinks that it can play 2017 with us, where it's like you'll do another election, we'll pretend to go and vote, and there's a winner. No, he's dealing with a completely different population. And even what we saw last week is a vote of no confidence by the people. When you have 25 counties coming out in numbers, they basically have said they have no faith in this government. You better put faith in IBC so that people can channel this anger to something. Otherwise, just prepare for disaster. Yeah. So me, I don't even know if I've answered your question.
Viva comrades, viva. Nerima has spoken quite largely. And if she was here yesterday when the IBC panel was speaking, Nerima, I think you would have had, I don't know, now you're having sleepless nights. I don't know, you will be nakesha too. We are not going back. Maandamano is just a tactic. And we are not pulling that out. Our mandamanos have had the government on their knees. We have illegitimized this government. And there is no way IBC is coming to legitimize it, even in 2027. And so this whole issue, what was your question? Sorry. Sorry.
My question is, how do we harness the levels, the high levels of political education, political engagement, so that we have structural changes coming out in 2027?
So this is my answer and a rally call to the senior people. And when I mean senior, I mean the senior generations, because the media has made it largely on an issue of generations. Yeah. Please, 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 you have the capacity to prepare us. Juu hatufiki 2027 ukweli. Juu kama if IBC is what we are seeing today, stating that we might not have an election in 2027. And right now, even the finance bill is even crazier. Right now, our phones are being tapped. Mercy's phone here, her WhatsApp shut down. And when I say her WhatsApp shut down, I mean her WhatsApp shut down from her end. But when you message her, the message is going through. But she has been spammed. And it's not only her. A war has been waged on people who believe to have rights. Now, young people, with the little education that we have, or the much, we realize that we have rights. And so it is upon ourselves to gather enough energy so that when power falls to the streets, we are the ones who are picking it up. So 2027, we might get there, but we might not. Yeah.
Thank you, Agui. Before we even address and allow the plenary to speak, there's also something else that I think has been festering underneath the surface, which is the question of accountability for what has already happened, even as we think about moving forward. So I believe all of us painfully watched, for the Kenyans, the speech by the Minister of the Interior the day after the protests, and the congratulatory messages that went to the police, but also the failure to acknowledge loss of life and the weight of the loss of life and what it should mean to a state when we keep losing people. And so I wanted Tina, before we close the conversation and open it up to plenary, to just also speak to the question of healing and accountability for what has already happened before we move forward. We know there have been instances of promises of compensation, but is that enough from a justice perspective? And how do we move away from reducing life to just an issue of money to creating proper accountability? Because without that kind of healing, we cannot move forward. So I'd like you to speak to that.
Thanks, Luciana, and thanks for all those powerful interventions that have been made by our panelists. This really fits within that long-term framing that I was speaking to earlier. We'll all remember the 4 agenda items. Those of us who worked during that era, agenda 1 to 4 is a very familiar phrase, but questioning how we tracked or followed that up to ensure completion or enforcement becomes the challenge. And it's not just a challenge that's been left to victims to carry, it's also a challenge within the sector, with donors and non-governmental organizations. A handful of activists, survivors, and NGOs have been left talking about the TGRC report, for instance. We haven't done very well in terms of drawing the connections between the post-election violence, the Kriegler report, the Waki Commission report, and Murkomen's statement 2 weeks ago. They're all interlinked. Now the challenge is how we quickly move on from event to event. We're not asking the hard questions and investing in the hard work, which is, what are the structural, what is underneath? Because Wango, if tomorrow Gen Zs take over power and the same structural issues are not resolved, these same scenarios will replay themselves all over again. And so it's a challenge that I want to issue to all of us, not just in Kenya. We're seeing it in South Sudan, where I also work. They fought so hard for more than 50 years to separate from their oppressor. Got independence in 2011, only to turn against themselves since 2013 to date. Same scenario, Sudan, DRC, we can name them. And so the critical thing is to understand that the ideals we're looking for are not in a vacuum. It's really going back to questioning, programming, investing on those structural barriers so that we can get ahead. Now, just to conclude on the accountability question, in fact, I think maybe it's in my wildest imagination as a human rights lawyer, if we really invested in holding some people accountable, truly, I think we'll begin to see some shift. And it's that moment in our reality as a global race, not just in Kenya, because we've seen it across the board, where we have to ask ourselves, there's so much to do and such little resources. Where do we focus? Where do we galvanize? Where do we center our energy so that we see some shift? Not a little pieces of shifts here and there, but something needs to really shift in terms of accountability. And I think there's a huge gaping hole when it comes to accountability. We're full of lip service, and it also asks something about us as a society, that we actually have women amongst us who were raped in 2007 who still have fistula, that we still have children who were born as a result of those rapes, that we still have some who have bullets lodged in their bodies. And rather than draw a line on that list of 40,000 victims who were documented by the TJRC, we've added on 2017, 2022, 2023, 4, and 5. I would suggest, because we've said it's the long game, to the Gen Zs, to the Gen Millennial, Gen Zotters, and solidarity across the region, let's invest our energy in holding some people, somebody accountable.
Thank you, Tina. Before I give room for a couple of questions, I'd like Arnold to also speak to us from, because he spoke about the importance of a global and a regional perspective. What does he recommend going forward that we put in place just to make sure that there are structures? Because as Tina is saying, we can't operate in a vacuum. If we're going to sustain the momentum, if we're going to sustain the change, there must be structures that carry that change forward. So what would you recommend that we put in place to move forward the conversation from here?
No, thank you. And let me just endorse what my sister just said about accountability, because there cannot be sustainable peace unless there's justice and accountability. But then what I was thinking about as you were speaking, which is what differentiates Kenya from the rest of other geographies of impunity, is that here we've seen a resurgence of a fairly independent judiciary, or conditions that allow for the judiciary to be independent. And their lack of independence may be more to do with themselves than interference from the executive or external forces. And therefore, there's need, I think, to also keep the judiciary as independent as possible and to hold it accountable in terms of how they organize themselves. And why I say so, I think it's a fundamental difference, because in the other countries that you refer to, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, possibly Zimbabwe, Tanzania, we see that the judicial institution, which is supposed to be the safeguarding institution for justice and accountability, those ones, they have significant challenges as a result of the structural circumstances in which they are that make them less independent. So which means here, there is an opportunity if we are able to document and to identify potential candidates for accountability and be intentional about it. And because that will then consolidate. Because what I have seen and heard as you were speaking is that in my country, in some countries, there's been the deliberate outsourcing of violence, of abductions, of enforced disappearances to what I can call quasi-militia institutions in order to try and create a delinkage from in terms of state responsibility, so that you don't have your security sector as being directly attributed to those violations. And if we don't hold someone to account here, these governments learn from each other. You are going to see that the incidences of abductions and enforced disappearances will increase, targeted. And once that happens, and you are not associating that with a specific identifiable state apparatus, then it becomes more difficult to then hold people to account. And so I think this is the time for what she was saying. And for that to happen, it means you also have institutions in the Constitution. Yesterday I heard that there is some form of independent police oversight mechanism.
Yeah.
And I don't know to what extent it has produced any result. It's captured. It's not independent. So I think those are some of the problems, because once you have that, which means the moment they begin to outsource to militias that operate with the acquiescence of the state, and then it's going to be even more complicated. And that's why I endorse what my sister is saying. Thank you.
All right. We'll come back. So allow me to open up the floor. Our panelists will get a chance to make closing statements. But because of time, I will just make one request. Please be brief, 30 seconds or less. If you can make a question rather than a lengthy statement, I would be grateful. All right? So that we can go to lunch promptly. So I'll only take one round. Please love me after this. Thank you. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Please remember, state very brief, 30 seconds or less. If I cut you off, please. Okay, 8. That's it, please. So we'll start in this order.
Very good.
Please also direct your question to someone in particular so that we make it easier for them to answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, this is the question I want to have asked in the previous session, but nonetheless, let me ask because there is a continuation. Let me ask a question to Arnold because my question is in the face of maybe an emerging and ruthless tyrants, for instance, who are not ready to, of course, to allow this Gen Z to exercise their constitutional rights. How will they be termed, for instance, in Kenya here? You see the president, for instance, unleashing the military and even the goons to, of course, to disrupt the whole process. How can that be termed? In the event, even the institution will collaborate with the state, and it's become very difficult to deal with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. 30 seconds or less? Thank you. Mr. Ogada.
You round it off to the nearest one. Wagoi, how are you? The Constitution of Kenya 2010 is a source of intergenerational dialogue. So that is a document that you can use and push for that dialogue to happen. If the politicians, the older guys are not listening to you, there's a way we push them in court for that dialogue to happen. And I saw you were sort of despondent, you want to be happy. Well, don't give up. Listen to this song by Chezidek, Reggae, Fight. Listen to that every morning when you tend to lose hope. Nerima, Siasa Place and what you're doing. There's a powerful office called the Registrar of Persons. Most of the rigging starts from there. That person is so powerful that he can decide this number of IDs go to this area, this within my office for a number of times. So think about litigation around that area and particularly around that office. Gen Zs, let's be practical. Leaderless, blah, blah, blah. We were having a conversation out there, but due to time I'll not repeat it here. But power is entrenched. How do you expect to get William Samoei Ruto and the machinery around him and occupy power? Practically not possible. And of course, with the madman in the US now edging them on, it's not practical. So what we can do locally here, let's be practical. Start with public participation. That's an area that has not been litigated and dealt with properly in terms of your capacity to change this country and to get things working. So public participation. The weakness of government and what you can achieve in terms of change in Kenya, please look at the politics out there. You see the West is recoiling internally. We have this crazy madman in Washington urging on dictators. Resolve and organize looking at those political dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ogata. Please do not follow Mr. Ogata's example. Step 2.
Thank you so much. He's my senior. I'm guided by him. My question is to Nerima, in her position as the director of Siasa Place. It's a very simple question, which is which spaces exist for intergenerational dialogue, and to that intergenerational dialogue also interclass dialogue, because our earlier conversation today was about class solidarity, and the struggle that we're in is a struggle for material things. So which spaces exist for that dialogue?
Okay, thank you. So that was number 3, 4, and 5 at the back. If you could also just state your name just so they respond to you by name, that would be all great.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Stanley Otieno. So I think I would want to pose this question to Tina and also to Arnold. So the first one would go to Arnold, because we're also looking into the future of democracy in East Africa and beyond. So how can we ensure that these the constitutional and the democratic gains of the older generations are not lost but adapted for the future? Because we are aware that some of the rights that we enjoy are as a result of the older generation. So how do we ensure that these things, they are not lost in the process of the intergenerational barazas, but they are adapted for the future? Then the second one to Tina, how do we ensure that these intergenerational dialogues or the barazas are not just symbolic, but this is translated into a shared power and joint decision making within these spheres? Thank you.
Okay. Please don't explain your question, just state your question. I'm really trying to be polite.
Thank you.
If you could keep it to one question, I would really love it.
All right, thank you. My name is Jacob Emoich. My question goes to both Arnold and Tina. The ESC Treaty envisions integration of the region both on a political and socio-economic front. I would like to know how far are we, and since your generation of leaders have failed to actualize this, do you think it will take the Gen Z leadership from both of this East African region to make this dream to come to pass? Thank you.
Okay, we have met the ones who blame millennials, ndiao. The ones who failed. That was number 5 and 6. They were on this side. 7 and 8 were on this side. Dictatorship. Hapa.
Thank you very much. I was about to protest. This table has been ignored for most of this conference.
I apologize.
And therefore, I take exception and I'll use 1 minute. So thank you once again. My name is Sarah Kasande. I'm from Uganda. I'd like to thank the panelists. I think for me, the fundamental framing of intergenerational building is important. And thank you, Arnold, for that, because it helps us avoid the pitfalls of us versus them. And as Tina has highlighted, that if we are to achieve systemic change, we cannot afford to be ahistorical. We must understand how the systems of power continue to persist, reinvent themselves, even in the face of significant change. So what lessons can we all learn from the past, from what has been done? How do we avoid those power dynamics that aim to separate us and all work towards a collective goal of achieving systemic change? And my point with relation to the last panel, and I'm sorry to add that, is we should avoid the issue of saying we're pursuing power for power's sake. Power is a means to achieve transformation and change. So that should be the ultimate goal, and power as a tool to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question. Please remember the dialogue can continue over the meal. You're not stuck to asking questions here.
Thank you. And two powerful panels this morning. And I had questions for the morning and questions for now, and I didn't manage. I wasn't seen, like she says. But I want to say that these two panels have given us hope moving forward. And although I had many points, I only want to say one, Miss Moderator, that the social justice centers, I want to give you information that you may not have. Like Nerima, I train across the counties. And I train human rights across the counties. And I have been shocked that as far as Mandera, which is the farthest part of Kenya from Nairobi, as far as Turkana, as far as Marsabit, I just called for community leaders training. And among the introductions, somebody says, I'm a representative of the Social Justice Center in Mandera, in Turkana, in Marsabit. So have hope. It's not just in Nairobi. You started off from Mathare, I know, but it is all over the country. So the movement is there. Me, I'm a hope person.
Thank you. Thank you for ending us on a hopeful note. So I'll allow the panelists just a couple of minutes to conclude, and then we can all go to lunch. Please, if you have a question or comment, feel free to raise it with them over the lunch break, all right? So we'll just go in this, So we'll just go in this order, kindly.
So as I gingerly approach the stage, there's something Nerima said about imprinting words that media eventually pick up.
Okay.
Perhaps a challenge to civil society organizations. Why are we saying abductions when we can say what it is? Enforced disappearances. So we also have a responsibility to use the right terminologies when we are pushing for, when we are pushing these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Wagoi.
As I answer or I make a remark on what Senior said about starting from public participations. Some of these public participations are co-opted. That's why as social justice movement, we started having people's assemblies in part of public participation. Because let me give you an example. I met comrade here. Please remind me your name, lawyer? Job. I met him in a public participation of Ngong Forest. And this public participation had been called by the KFS after pictures had surfaced of, what was they calling it? Eco Lodge. Eco Lodge, 4 houses, I think, in the forest, aimed to harbor people who are coming for AFCON. And it was crazy because a public participation had been done. This is after these houses are seen on the internet. A public participation had been held, but the public participation that had been pushed through was for creation of a perimeter wall, protecting the forest. And now, kumbe subconsciously we had accepted for an eco launch to be built in the forest. And we didn't know, as we had passed for the building of what? Of a fence, not even a perimeter wall, because this is a forest. It's supposed to be something very friendly to the forest. And an eco launch was built instead. So we have to come up with things that work for us, because this government is just in shambles. So we have spoken, now these are my final remarks. We have spoken about the role of women and the continuous effort that women have put in this struggle, not only here in Kenya, but all around the continent. And on 25th June of last month, as we commemorated our comrades who were shot in Parliament last year, crazy things happened in CBD. Women were raped by goons. Goons were accompanied by police. Police and goons looted the city. And a comrade of mine wrote a poem. I am an artist, a visual artist, nachoranga, I draw. But we say it is the role of artists to make the revolution irresistible. And so as I end, I'll leave you with a poem that was written by Tafari. Watu wangu wa media wako wapi? Propaganda. Let me read it for you guys. It's written to brothers. It was written by a brother to brothers. To my brothers, what we need to understand. After the night of June 25th, when state hired goons used rape as a weapon against women protesting for justice in Kenya. Brothers, we need to talk about what happened that night. Not as distant observers, not as sympathetic allies, but as men who benefit from the system that made this violence possible. The goons who hunted women in the darkness, they are not anomalized. They are the logical extensions of what we have built together. A world where women's bodies are battlegrounds for men. Every time you laughed at the rape jokes, stayed silent when your friend talked about putting her in her place, every time you treated women's fear as overreaction, you laid groundwork for that night. The state did not invent rape as a weapon. We did. In our homes, our workplaces, our streets. The goons just made visible what we have always known, that women's bodies are currency in men's wars. Brothers, I need you to sit down with this. Those women were raped because they dared to demand for justice. The message was clear. Step out of line and we will destroy what you think belongs to you, your bodily autonomy, your right to exist without terror. This is what male supremacy looks like when it drops the mask. But here's what we don't want to admit. Every day, we participate in the systems that make women calculate their safety. And that makes them text their friends when they get home, and that makes them carry keys between their fingers. We are not the good guys watching from the sidelines. We are the members of the class that hold power through violence and the threat of violence. The goons were hired, but we have been doing this work for free our whole lives. So, what now? Stop waiting for women to teach you about patriarchy. Stop expecting them to manage your learning process. Stop making your enlightenment their emotional labor. Start disrupting other men. Not gently, not diplomatically. Disrupt them the way they disrupt women's lives. Understand that your comfort is built on their fear. Your freedom of movement exists because theirs is constrained. The women who were violated that night were fighting for a Kenya where justice is possible. They were brutalized for that vision. The question is not whether you support them. The question is, what are you willing to sacrifice of your male privilege to make this vision possible? Because until we are willing to lose power, we are just more goons in better clothing. This is not about being a better man. This is not about this is about dismantling the system that makes men the ones who get to be better or worse, while women keep paying the price either way. More power to the people, more power.
Thank you, Wangoi. Arnold, you can go ahead.
Thank you. So I'll be brief and just collapse into a general response. And I think, with all due respect, most of the solutions to the country's problems will come from the people in here. So I think with the one thing that we need to do is to envision institutions. I think it's Justice yesterday who spoke about the fact that if we believe in separation of powers as a model of governance, then we need to have institutions that are envisioned in terms of the Constitution and move away from the strongman syndrome. And from the responses that I got, it's very clear to me that unless we are able to defend the judiciary and other institutions of accountability, justice and accountability, that will be the next arena of conflict. The judiciary is definitely going to be undermined, it's going to be infiltrated, and I think it's going to be weakened, because that's an institution of accountability. And it logically follows that if we have goons and people who are committing violations with impunity, the only guarantee for impunity is if you have got a weak police force or co-opted police force, which I think we do have, but also a weak judiciary. The judiciary is being weakened, but it's still strong enough to be able to carry out accountability, provided what Ogada said, we use the lawyers in order to strengthen our transformation initiatives. So around the question of public participation, I totally agree with him that if there hasn't been a process to test the ability of the judiciary to contribute to the strengthening of civic participation, that may be an area. And then the question of young people being taken as strategic partners and not afterthoughts. I think you are very lucky as a country that you have young people who have provided leadership. In many countries, like I think Senegal was closest to what is happening here, when Wade, who was a long-term president, tried to extend his term. The older generations were the ones who were traditionally fighting for democracy and being involved in elections. But you then had, I think it was called the San Mare movement, where the youth began to take it upon themselves. And it actually produced a result which had momentum, that even when President Sall tried to extend his term, it failed, because a combination of young people and a strong independent judiciary resulted in elections being held when he was trying to postpone them. So here we have a convergence where the old people, I mean old activists, Jerry and others, a person like Willie Mutunga and my sister here, and the Gen Z and young people, there's that convergence which you then need strong institutions to be able to pull through. And then the vision has to be institutional visions, not individual visions. Thank you.
I had one question from Cheptum, and I would say there's spaces that exist for interclass institutions, higher learning, vocational. But one that's very interesting, when the protest started last year, Occupy churches. Churches is big. And even All Saints, when they had their service on the 22nd, I knew from that service the turnout for the 25th was going to be large. Because that was an example of an interclass gathering at All Saints. And also why on the front page today, the president is trying to build a 1.2 billion church. Because he knows that. So I would say, as much as a lot of younger people are not religious, it's to think of the church as a political organizing tool. Is something that I'm constantly trying to push. And also, it's to deplatform rogue politicians from the church. That's where our power lies. And in conclusion from this conversation, I would say that, you know, democracy is built. It's something that I believe oftentimes it's renewed by generations, but it must be protected. And I'm so proud to see young people basically protecting our constitution. That is what they are doing. And they are living it. I think this is something that we must drill into the heads of people who were clamoring for a constitution. It's young people who are saying, okay, it's here, we are protecting it. And that's where that intergenerational convening comes. So to have the courage, young people as the engine, but we need older generations for strategy, is where the power lies.
Thank you so much. Going last, I think a lot has been said, so I'll just complement what the rest of the panelists have said. So there was a point that Arnold had made earlier asking about IPOA, but you've actually come back and responded to the issue in terms of institutions. And I go back to the long term. I can't run away from it because we set up an independent policing oversight authority, which is very, very weak. Extremely weak. I mean, sometimes when the commissioners or the chairperson are put in front of the media to respond to questions about how far they've gone with their investigations, they don't even have the capacity to do the bulk of what we have tasked them to do in that law. And that's why I'm going back to, when I speak about Kenya, and I'm sure it's the same for all of our different countries. Today, if we go back and look at what we aspired to achieve through the constitutional reforms, through the National Land Commission, through the National Gender Inequality Commission, through the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and take a step back and ask ourselves, where are we? And that's why I'm saying, let's try. We can offer the leadership, which is already being provided, social justice centers, Siasa Place, and ICJ and others. Take a step back. Let's try not to be event-oriented, but build on the long term. Now, what that's going to mean for us now, to the two questions that were posed to me, is in the normative framing, particularly when we look at human rights, we've tended to look more at the state. The state is the duty bearer. The state must do X, Y, Z. This same state. So today, what do we ask CS Murkomen? What do we ask the IG? What do we ask? This is the state. And that's where you begin to see the innovation, for instance, by the opposition group, Martha Karua, Eugene Kalonzo, the establishment of the People's, what is it called? People Justice. There's a commission that's been set up. Last week I had people ask, and I was in several WhatsApp groups, I'm sure you also, some were asking, sasa wakioccupy State House alafu? Or there have been debates I've seen on X Space. What was the value of 25th protest last week? There is significant value in the protection because we are saying a statement that of defiance is basically speaking back to the state to say, not at this cost. We will push back. And that's why I end by saying, for young people so that it's not tokenistic and continuing to strengthen this bridge between different generations requires a huge investment. And I'm speaking to ourselves, the ICJs and the rest of us. We should put the money in documenting, exchanging, building the knowledge, because it doesn't pass itself through the air, right? It's speaking to Njeri, it's speaking to Arnold, it's speaking to all of us together and recreating and building. That's where the investment needs to go. When the Constitution was about to be promulgated in 2010 and prior, Uraia gave money across the country, every nook and corner. There was public education. Why are we not seeing those resources being channeled to the social justice centers in Mandera, in Lamu, in Kilgoris, all across this country? I think it's a moment for us to really ask ourselves, where must the investment go to shift the tide? Because otherwise, we will continue to replay the script book as we've seen it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. My panelists, Tina Lai, Nerima Wako, Arnold Sunga, happy birthday again. And Wangui, thank you so much. So let's do an emoji clap. You don't need to move around your hands. Just raise your hand.